Good afternoon. Welcome to Cool Springs. Today is Thursday, February 20th, 2025, and this is our series, Heroes and Heroines of the Church. We weren't able to take yesterday, so we made arrangements to do it today. Today is exactly 1 month since our new president was installed into office, and it's also in the recent news. More hostages have been released, some of them alive, some of them dead, from the conflict with Israel and the Hamas terrorists. And the nation of Israel is having to deal with the anger and the heartbreak of learning definitively that the two youngest hostages, who were 9 months of age and 4 years of age when they were taken captive, are coming back home in coffins. They did not survive the time of being kidnapped and tortured in captivity. And so the nation is reeling from that. So it seemed like a good time to pick this particular person as the topic for the heroes and heroines of the church. In the run-up to World War II in Germany, there was a young man who was a theologian, and he'd had a couple of opportunities to come to the United States that he took, and at least one opportunity to go spend time studying in seminaries in England. So he could have avoided going back into Germany as Hitler was rising to power and beginning not only his persecution of the Jewish people, but the crushing of any opposition from the German churches for standing up for God's truth and for treating people properly. The fellow's name was Dietrich Bonhoffer. He was ultimately arrested and executed by the Germans in April of 1945, literally just a couple of weeks before the last place that he was imprisoned was liberated. Dietrich Bonhoffer was a German. He felt called to teaching theology and doing pastoral type ministry. And like I said, there were a couple of times in the 1930s when he had the opportunity to go to England and did, and to come to the United States and did. And so he could have avoided going back in to Hitler's Germany. Could have waited until the war was over with, was advised by a lot of people to do that. But he decided no, he wouldn't have the moral voice to help the nation recover the aftermath of the tragedy of Nazi Germany if he wasn't there to participate with his people in the hardship. So he willingly went back to Germany and was pastoring churches. And in September of 1933, Hitler's now fully in power, and the web of darkness and suppression of free speech and suppression of worship was already beginning to crush the churches, where the churches had to decide whether they were going to be German churches and follow the Nazi propaganda, or were they going to be true to what they knew the Word of God to really stand for. And so Bonhoffer, as a pastor, was instrumental in forming something that was first called the Pastors' Emergency League, where he and other ministers of the gospel throughout Germany and Austria and some of the lands that Hitler was beginning to conquer were encouraging each other and continuing to speak truth, even though they were coming under increasing persecution for doing so. And that Pastors' Emergency League wound up becoming the confessional church, made up not just of Lutherans, his particular denomination, but of any Christian denomination, where they were going to stand solely on the Word of God and not on the governments telling them how they were to worship and putting state ahead of God. The chaplain corps motto for the U.S. Army, I worked for the U.S. Army in the chaplaincy division as a director of religious education for nearly 25 years. And the chaplain corps motto is Pro Deo et Patria, for God and country. We have it in the right order. God first and foremost, always. And then your loyalty to your nation cannot supersede your loyalty to God and His Word. So Bonhoffer was continuing to preach and encourage other pastors, even under increasing persecution. And he wound up being arrested in 1943. And at first he was sent to the Tegel prison, and then ultimately to Flossenburg. And like I said, in April 1945, by then, the Allies have pushed into Germany. Hitler and his henchmen are now down in the bunkers in Berlin. And it's obvious to everybody that it's just a matter of time until Nazi Germany is going to be defeated. But evil wants to go out kicking and screaming. And so in the final few days of the Third Reich, many people were being put to death solely for having stood up for right and good. Bonhoffer was executed by hanging, and there are differing accounts historically as to whether or not he died very quickly or whether or not, because the Germans were fond of torturing people while they were executing them, whether or not it took a slow, agonizing time for him to die. One of the things that makes me remember Bonhoffer particularly is because the place that he was executed at, the Flossenburg prison work camp, happened to be the camp that my father's World War II Army Combat Engineer Unit liberated. They just got there less than a month late in the eyes of the world. Flossenburg got liberated, but 2 weeks before the camp gets liberated, Bonhoffer and a lot of other pastors were executed for standing for God and putting God ahead of country. Some of the works that Dietrich Bonhoffer did that have been studied ever since then, including some letters that he was able to get smuggled out from the prison while he was in a Nazi jail for 2 years. Some of the guards were actually kind of sympathetic and would allow food to be snuck into him and would sneak out the letters that he was sending to pastors and to churches. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letters from Prison is important reading for anybody who wants to study theology and to understand what it means sometimes to be a disciple of Christ. And another work, The Cost of Discipleship, is a very, very important work on what it means to literally take up your cross and follow Jesus. Bonhoeffer certainly lived that because, like I said, he had numerous opportunities as a German citizen and as a pastor theologian to get out of Nazi Germany and be in places where he would have been safe from arrest, safe from persecution, free to speak out for the cause of Christ. But he chose to go back in and risk arrest and death to be with the people who were suffering too. He understood the cost of discipleship. It's now the 21st century. This is the year 2025. Dietrich Bonhoeffer died in 1945. And the cost of discipleship and choosing to speak out what you know to be God's truth, even if it means you're going to come under government persecution, is still around. We just saw in the news this past week where our vice president was over in Europe, and one of the things that he criticized European governments for is the fact that they are restricting people's freedom of speech. And he was criticized by the European governments for it, and by some of the media here in our own country for it. One of those media sources actually went and found 3 European political and news figures, and this American news outlet was interviewing them, and they were sitting there looking across at this reporter with a straight face, saying, yes, in our countries, you can be arrested and you can face all sorts of fines and criminal punishment and jail time for saying something that is deemed to be offensive. Persecution is alive and well in the 21st century, like it was in the 20th century, like it will be during the last days, when the cost of being a disciple of Christ and speaking out publicly for Christ may very well cost a believer their life, like it cost Reverend Bonhoffer his life for standing tall for the gospel. So we can learn from these heroes and heroines of the faith, because persecution is not something that was in another country or way back when. It's alive and well, and people need to count the cost of being a disciple. Thanks for watching.